Testing? Yes. Thank you very much for that great introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this event. We have a lot of distinguished speakers today. Of course, Richard Hoagland, as I'm sure you all know, and Richard Dolan, Timothy Good, Ed Grimsley. I feel like I'm opening for the Rolling Stones. And who remembers the first act, right? But I'll try to make this memorable for you. We're talking about the origins of the secret space program. And I'm going to introduce to you some things of which you're probably already very familiar, and yet in a different way perhaps than you're used to thinking about it. So don't be dismayed if at the beginning this does not seem relevant, because I will show you how and why it is. A seminal event for me in the secret space program began in June of 1947. No, I wasn't around in June of 1947, but historically it was a seminal event. And many of you have heard of the Maury Island affair, a very strange, bizarre incident that took place on the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Shortly after Kenneth Arnold, a pilot, gave us the term flying saucer that month, there was a UFO sighting. In this sighting, UFOs evidently crashed, rained debris down upon some civilians, killed a dog, according to the story, wounded a child, according to the story. And it led to a chain of events that are very, very unusual, and yet are evidence of something that took place 20 years later that shows us there was a deep connection between the UFO story, as it was promulgated back in the 1940s, and very serious political and military events of the next 20, 30 years. So, Maury Island affair, there's a UFO sighting shortly after Kenneth Arnold gave us the famous flying saucer story. And a man that we know as Fred Krisman claimed that he had been involved in that incident. He claimed that people had been hurt, that he had pieces of the UFO. And what happened was, individuals of the United States Army Air Force at the time visited Krisman and his partner, Mr. Dahl, and retrieved pieces of this so-called debris of the UFO. They got on a plane, the plane crashed, and both of these Air Force officers died. These are probably the first two victims, mortalities associated with the UFO phenomenon. The first two, there were many more since then, as any student of UFO history knows. So Fred Krisman is this strange guy, a strange background. No one knows too much about him. He seems to have been some kind of confidence man, some kind of criminal, a crook, but maybe also an intelligence agent. There is evidence that there were intelligence connections to his background. He was also somebody I like to call a wandering bishop, and I'll get to that story in a minute, because this is a striking aspect of this whole field that people have not covered because they don't understand it. Fred Krisman, 1947, seminal event in UFO history. He shows up again 20 years later, being investigated by a district attorney, Jim Garrison, in New Orleans, because of his alleged role in the Kennedy assassination. We'll come back to that in a minute. One of the people investigating the Maury Island affair and all of the UFO incidents that were taking place in the Pacific Northwest in 1947, in the months before and after the famous Roswell crash, was this man, FBI Special Agent in Charge, stationed in Butte, Montana. He was in charge of a bunch of files we call the SM-X files. According to the FBI's own documentation, UFO matters were classified as SM-X, Security Matter-X. These were the original X files. This man's name is Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is the man who will come up again in our discussion 20 years later as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. If you saw the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, this was Guy Bannister, the actor playing Guy Bannister. Now we come to another man called Jack Martin. Jack Martin's real name is Edward Suggs. He worked as an investigator for Guy Bannister. He was another bishop. We'll get to that story in a bit. He's probably the same guy as the name that comes up in the files of the Office of Special Investigations of the military as Agent Jack S. Martin, who was investigating UFO incidents in California in 1949. In the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, Jack Lemmon plays Jack Martin. I'm showing you these photographs from the film so you get a kind of context. If you've seen the film, you know that we're talking about real people, real individuals, and their real influence. Of course, Oliver Stone does not go into the UFO aspect of this case. These photographs have never been seen before in public. You're the first people in the entire world that is actually seeing these photographs because they're photographs that were given to me personally by a man who was involved with Jack Martin. Jack Martin, the Jack Lemmon character in JFK, the man involved, they say, in the Kennedy conspiracy in New Orleans, was also, in addition to being an investigator, in addition to being possibly a man investigating UFO incidents in California, in addition to being heavily involved in the group around Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1963, was also a bishop in a church, in a weird church, in a church that no one had ever heard of before, in a church that even Jim Garrison didn't understand. In his own documentation, in his own writings, going back to the House Select Subcommittee on Assassinations when the United States government was going through an investigation of the assassinations in the 1970s, Jim Garrison wrote a note, copies of which I have, saying, look into this church stuff because I don't understand it. Well, there's Jack Martin dressed as a priest in the 1970s after the Kennedy assassination. His friend and associate was David Ferrie. David Ferrie and Jack Martin both worked for Guy Bannister. David Ferrie, former Eastern Airlines pilot, rabid anti-communist, very much involved in anti-communist activities. He's another bishop of the same church as Jack Martin. And of course, he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, as we know, in the Civil Air Patrol. In the movie, that was David Ferrie, unforgettable guy in a fake wig and fake eyebrows, talking about enigmas wrapped in mysteries, wrapped in puzzles, wrapped in all kinds of things. So this is the David Ferrie character that made famous in the film. And this is an actual photograph of David Ferrie dressed again as a priest, as Jack Martin was. We have co-conspirators in the Kennedy assassination, as we will see, ties back to the UFO and the space program, who were involved in a strange church, a church that didn't really exist except on paper. And this is the church, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. If you review the FBI files, all of the investigations that were undertaken for the Warren Commission, and later by the House Subcommittee in the 1970s, this name will keep coming up, and no one does any background check on it, no one goes any further. Members of this church included a man called Profeta, we'll get to him in a second, David Ferrie, Jack Martin, a man called Carl Stanley, who was mentioned in the FBI files, Tommy Jude Baumler, Thomas Beckham. These are all names familiar to researchers in the Kennedy assassination. They were all members of this church, most of whom were bishops in the church. The church had a lot of bishops, not many priests, and no congregations. Seriously. Just bishops, no priests, no congregations. Rarely did they have a building. This photograph was taken in the only building I ever knew that housed the American Orthodox Catholic Church in the Bronx, where I'm from. And I knew the church personally. I knew these individuals personally. I knew this guy right here. That's Profeta, the guy who created the church. I knew him. And I was a member briefly of this group because I lived practically next door. And it's a long story, and I won't get into it now. I won't bore you with it. But the other names on this list are extremely important. Ferrie and Martin, we already know, involved in the Kennedy assassination conspiracy, at least according to Jim Garrison. Tommy Jude Baumler was a lawyer in New Orleans, and his claim to fame, as we found out only about a year ago, was that he was the man who incorporated another church, this one called the Process Church of the Final Resurrection, of the Final Judgment, rather, Process Church of the Final Judgment. This was the group that was implicated, rightly or wrongly, in the Charles Manson family, in possibly the Bobby Kennedy assassination. It goes on and on. There are all these churches that swim underneath the radar that have connections to intelligence agencies, the military, and as we will see, to the space program. This was Profeta. I knew this guy personally, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest who left the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to create this church of his own, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. He was picked by Thomas Dewey as the White House chaplain. There was an election between Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey. Everyone thought Dewey would win. Dewey was the Republican. Truman was the Democrat. Truman won by a narrow margin, and Profeta once showed me the letter that he got from Thomas Dewey appointing him as White House chaplain when Dewey thought he had won the election. This is how politically prominent and important he was. On the board of directors of the American Orthodox Catholic Church was J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the FBI, the man who gave us the X-Files and Guy Bannister and all the rest. J. Edgar Hoover was a member and on the board of directors of this phony church. Another member was Christopher Maria Stanley. He's now known as Saint Christopher Stanley. He was canonized by the guy who took over when he died. Close associate of all these guys. Ferry Martin tried to implicate him in the Kennedy assassination. He tried to implicate them in the Kennedy assassination. When Profeta had created the American Orthodox Catholic Church, he summoned all the other bishops who had been bishops with him in this church to go to New York and present their bona fides, their bona fides, their credentials to him and to Hoover. The only one who obeyed this was Carl Stanley, Christopher Maria Stanley. Christopher Stanley goes to New York, he goes to Profeta, he signs on, he goes back to his home in Kentucky, he's dead less than a month later, and only 2 weeks after the death of David Ferry, the mysterious death of David Ferry, another bishop in the same church. Suddenly the bishops of this church were all being killed. They were all dying under mysterious circumstances, all within a few weeks of each other. This story you have not heard before, because no one knows what to do with the material. No one knows what to do with this information. So when it comes to churches and guys in funny hats, you know, there is some degree of mystery out there and confusion. This is the organization as I, over the years, uncovered it, starting with our friend Profeta over there, to Christopher Stanley, to David Ferry, to Jack Martin. These were all guys implicated in the Kennedy assassination, and they all wore funny hats. The connection was this. Another funny hat, that's J. Edgar Hoover in his Masonic Shriner fez, because he was a Freemason, as I think we all know. So there's J. Edgar Hoover, to Guy Bannister, the guy who investigated the UFOs in 1947, the guy who was writing up all these telexes and letters headlined SM-X file, UFO sighting here, UFO sighting there. Down here is Fred Krisman. He was the guy that Bannister was allegedly investigating. And next to Krisman, there's Profeta again. Profeta, who was on the same board of directors of a church as J. Edgar Hoover. All these people working in concert, all these people working together, a phony church, mysterious goings-on, and really weird hats. So what does all this have to do with the space program? You're sitting there thinking, okay, this is all very strange, but what are we here for? Well, let's fall back a little bit. We'll start to see the threads come together. In the United States, the space race began on Halloween 1936. And you're looking at this charming group of individuals down there, relaxing in front of a rocket. These were America's first rocket scientists. People like Jack Parsons, Theodore von Karman, and this is the launch at Arroyo Seco in California on October 31st, 1936. The very first launching of a rocket by American space engineers. Jack Parsons has a crater on the moon named after him. Jack Parsons was a co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, at Caltech in California. When you watch the space shuttle launches or you read anything about it, you'll always come across JPL all the time. He was a co-founder of JPL. Crater on the moon named after him. Solved a lot of issues regarding solid fuel storage of rocket material. And at the same time, he was a follower of Allister Crowley. The Allister Crowley, the infamous magician who created his own cult, his own religion. Parsons himself, at the same time he's working on rockets, for the U.S. military, he's also conducting rituals in the desert trying to summon angels and demons. I'm not making this stuff up, in case you're wondering. One of his co-workers, one of his partners in his ritual working, his ritual magic, was L. Ron Hubbard, the man who later went on to found Scientology. Hubbard stole Jack Parsons' money, stole Jack Parsons' girlfriend, ran to Miami and bought a boat. In later years, Hubbard would speak very fondly of Allister Crowley, claiming he had met him. He never did. Crowley died in 1947, before Hubbard had even actually heard of him. But Parsons was investigated by the FBI as a security risk because he was involved in occult workings. But at the same time, Parsons is a brilliant scientist. Well, just as he's getting ready to leave the United States through all the pressure of the FBI investigations, there's a mysterious explosion at his home. He dies under very mysterious circumstances. The house literally blows up with him in it. Theodor von Karman was the leader of the group that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He has a crater on the moon named after him. Born in Hungary, studied in Germany. He was a brilliant rocket scientist as well. And he formed the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with a couple of other people, Frank Molina and, of course, Parsons, Ed Foreman, and a Chinese scientist, another brilliant man called Qian Suisun. Qian Suisun goes on to later fame in another area of rocket science and space science. So von Karman was a guy shown here, by the way, with a Nazi scientist down here. This is Qian up here, and this is von Karman. This scientist, von Karman had known before in Germany and was instrumental in getting him to come to the United States to work on the space program with him. Qian was the man they sent to debrief Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun, of course, was the Nazi scientist that was brought to the United States under something called paperclip. Wernher von Braun we'll get into in more detail just in a few minutes. But Qian was also investigated by the FBI. Everybody involved in the rocket program in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s wound up being investigated by the FBI for one reason or another. He eventually got so sick and tired he defected to China after all of the harassment he had been undergoing by the FBI. And what happened? He develops China's space program. He creates the Silkworm missile that was used to such effect during the first Iraq invasion. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and all of that, he was sending Scud missiles and all of this. The Silkworms were in use there in the Middle East. So Qian, starting as a patriotic American citizen helping with the space program, through all the suppression by FBI, all the harassment, gives up, basically, goes back to China, and becomes a hero in China, develops, jumpstarts the Chinese space program. When we're talking today about the space race and the space programs, as we'll be getting into with the other speakers, keep in mind the fact that it began in two important places. It began in Germany, with the rocket systems and the rocket development in Germany at Peenemünde, Nordhausen, which we'll get into in a second. But it also started in the United States. And the reason that China is launching rockets today and launching satellites is because of this man, who could have been part of our space program for the rest of his life, and instead, because of all sorts of political nonsense, wound up going to China and giving them a space program almost complete. At the same time in Germany, in the same year, almost the same month, 1936, we have Fritz Goslau of the Argus Company. He begins work on remote-controlled aircraft. And a few years later, December of 1942, we have the first launch, successful launch of the V-1. If you've been following History Channel stuff about World War II and the Blitz and all of that, you'll know about the V-1s and the devastating effect that they had. This is a picture of the V-1 at the time, and this is another one. Later termed the world's first cruise missile. These were launched from aircraft. The V-1 would drop from a plane and then go on its way. Aimed at London, of course, and later, as we know, at Antwerp. Devastating weapon, resulting in almost 23,000 civilian deaths at the time. But at the same time, back in 1941, we have the first jet-assisted takeoff launch in California by the von Karman group. Jack Parsons is here. We have Jack Parsons right here watching the takeoff of the first jet-assisted takeoff plane, a jet-powered plane. So here we have the rocket scientist who's also an occultist and the follower of Allister Crowley and a member of all kinds of other occult organizations involved in these important events of the rocket program. In 1944, of course, we have the V2. The Germans launched the V2. Actually, more people were killed making the V2 than were killed by the V2 because of slave labor in Germany and because of the concentration camp labor that was brought to Nordhausen and later to Mittelbau-Dora concentration camps and the factories attached to Buchenwald. More people were actually killed making these V2s than were actually killed in suffering under them. So the Nazi rocket program, as we know it, started at Peenemünde, was later relocated, and the person in charge of this was General Walter Dornberger, and his assistant was Wernher von Braun. We'll get back to them in a second. Another important personality in aviation medicine this time was Dr. Hubertus Struckold. He's a man in charge of all sorts of horrendous experiments on living persons in the camps, and yet is considered the father of aviation medicine. He was brought to the United States. He was given his own institute at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, and they had a building named after him until the local Daughters of the American Revolution decided that having a building named after this guy was probably not the best message to send to our next generations of young people studying medicine, so they took the name off. People were aware that Struckold was basically a monster. We've all heard of Operation Paperclip, I think. Started as Operation Crossbow, Operation Overcast. The British were trying to get the scientists, Russians were trying to get Nazi scientists, and the Americans had their own program, which they then later renamed as Paperclip. It wasn't just the men, the scientists they were bringing over, it was also their documentation. It was also as much machinery as they could possibly get. We are talking about hundreds of railroad cars, freight cars filled with documents and equipment and machinery. Not talking even about the hundreds at first, and then thousands of Nazi scientists that were brought to the United States. Here's a photograph of the team at Fort Bliss, Texas, Paperclip members. That's a hell of a lot of Nazi scientists. And not a single funny hat among them, I will point out. One thing that's important to remember about the space program in the United States, until 1957, it was not a civilian program. For the first 10 years, or 15 years of its existence, it was a military program. There was no NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration had not been created yet. So all of these people worked for the military. The rocket program was a military program, and you have to remember that's the origins of the space program, was with the Army, which later became the Army Air Force, which later became NASA. The space program went under NASA. These were supposed to be our Nazis, right? We were sold a bill of goods. The United States was told us, oh, these people are not really Nazis. They were Germans, they were scientists, they were helping out, they were working for us, they really weren't believers. Yeah, right. Why then, if this is so, did we bring the best and the brightest to the United States, give them whatever they wanted, all the resources that they wanted, whatever they needed, whatever they asked for? And the Soviet Union was the first country to launch a satellite into space. If they were really working for the United States and they had become born-again American patriots and card-carrying Republicans, yes, Republicans, how did it happen that we didn't get a rocket into space, we didn't get a satellite into space, that the Russians were the first? Well, what happened? Weren't they sabotaging our space program since the very beginning? These are the true believers. This is just a handful of the people you'll come across when you research this. Walter Dornberger later becomes the head of NASA. Later gets a board position with Bell Aerospace in the United States. Is considered a rabid Nazi by military intelligence officials who are doing background checks in Germany. They've got witness statements, they've got documents, they've got everything they need to put Dornberger in jail for the rest of his life. Those documents are buried. Wernher von Braun was an SS major. There are photographs of Wernher von Braun in an SS uniform. The SS was not the Rotary. It was not the Boy Scouts. You didn't just, kind of join the SS because it would further your career. No. That didn't work that way. In order to join the SS, you had to prove your racial purity, going back to the year 1750. There had to be no Untermenschen in your background, right? No Jews, no Gypsies, no Slavs, no Democrats. Nobody like that in the background of your racial purity. You had to prove this, and you had to maintain a certain degree of involvement with the SS all the time. The SS was a pagan cult. The SS forbade mention of Christian holidays even in their documentation. The SS was extremely pagan, was extremely anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-everything else. If you had a rank of major in the SS, you did not get that automatically. You got that because you proved yourself. And Werner von Braun was proven later to have been involved in meetings discussing slave labor requirements for the rocket systems at Peenemünde and also at Mittelbau. He was involved in these discussions. He knew about the killings of prisoners, the torture of prisoners. He was involved in all of that. It didn't matter to Werner von Braun. At the same time that he's working for us, we bring him over under paperclip. He's now in the United States. What is he doing? He's sending classified materials out of the country to his comrades back in Germany. We know this. It's part of the documentation. It's part of the record now. These files have been declassified. Werner von Braun was working against the United States almost from the beginning. This is a scandal, But yet we consider him the father of the American space program. I mean, he's the one who got us to the moon, right? Kurt Debus was the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, the first director of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida. He was a member of the SS and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, two other Nazi organizations. This is the man who turned in his friends and co-workers to the Gestapo if they made disloyal remarks. This was a true believer, once again. As I say, he was an SS officer. The Allies considered the SS a criminal organization for very good reason. And yet, we put this guy in charge of the Kennedy Space Center. Theodor Zobel, another scientist, performed experiments on prisoners in the wind tunnel experiments. We brought him over. He worked for us. Hubertus Strückholt, as I mentioned, tortured prisoners, killed people just for experiments, dumped them into freezing cold water to see how long they would survive. Stuff like that. Jumpstarts the Aviation Medicine Institute at Randolph Air Force Base. George Rickey,